All right, hi everybody. I usually jump right into questions and give a quick update, but today we're going to do things a little bit differently. I'm going to go into a little bit of history about the island and the progress that we've made with Project Puffin out here, and the history of the puffins on Seal Island for those of you that aren't familiar with the history of Seal Island and the Puffin Project. And then after that, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about the season that we had out here. We had an excellent season. I'll tell you a little bit about how successful the puffins were in raising their chicks, as well as the terns and some other species. And we'll also go into a bit of detail about the diet of the puffins, as well as the terns that are nesting on the island. And I'll tell you a little bit about what's going on now as the season starts to wind down. And after we get through all that, I'm going to jump into a little bit of the questions that you guys are probably going to send in to me soon. 20 miles off of the mainland from Rockland, Maine, which is about mid-coast in Maine. It's a pretty remote location on here. We don't have any running water. We're living primarily out of our tents, and we have one research cabin where we keep all of our gear. We have a little kitchen in there where we cook all of our food and things like that. And we have one outhouse that we use on the island, and it's a very basic camp. There isn't too much going on out here. There's no other people living out here. The island is only about 70 acres, so it's not huge, and there's no trees on the island. The island is home to a lot of nesting seabird species, not just puffins. As you know, we have over 500 pairs of puffins nesting on Seal Island. We also have razorbills, about 50 pairs, maybe a little bit more or less, it's hard to tell. Lots of black guillemots nesting, well over 700 pairs of black guillemots. We also have around 900 pairs of Arctic terns and maybe 13 pairs of common terns. We also have leeches storm petrels that are nesting all over the island, as well as common eiders, herring gulls, great blackback gulls, great cormorants, which is a very special species that I'll get into soon, and the double-crested cormorant. They all breed on this island. But if we go back in time a little bit, into the 1800s and the 1900s, there was almost no puffins that were nesting in this area in Maine. The egg and feather trade wiped out most of the nesting seabirds along the coast of Maine, including on Seal Island. And at the turn of the 1900s, there was only one pair of puffins nesting over on Matinicus Rock, which is it's another Project Puffin island that's nesting. They're nesting just about 8 miles southeast of Seal Island. And they have over 500 pairs of puffins as well, and there's another research team out there. But there's only a single pair of puffins there into the early 1900s. And there's another puffin colony called Machias Seal Island, which is up in Canada at the mouth of the Bay of Fundy, right on the border of Maine and Canada. So they were nesting in those two locations in the 1900s, and that was it for the entire Gulf of Maine and for the entire United States. So Dr. Kress, who is my boss, and he is the president of Project Puffin and the director of all of our research activities, his idea in the early 80s was to bring back puffins where there was still good habitat to islands like Matinicus Rock and Seal Island and Eastern Egg Rock. And what they did was they actually they flew up to Newfoundland, and on Seal Island they started this work in 1984. And they gathered up puffin chicks on a thriving colony that were about 12 days old, and they flew them all the way back down here to Seal Island, and they created sod burrows in the ground where they hand-reared these puffins, and they fed them daily and they gave them vitamins until they fledged. And as many of you know, with a puffin chick, like little Conrad this year, when they fledge, they're all on their own without their parents. So the hope was that the puffins that were being hand-reared here would eventually come back and nest on the island. Now over just around 1,000 pairs of puffin chicks, rather, were brought to Seal Island between 1984 and 1989, and they are hand-reared on the island, as I said. But it wasn't until 1992 that puffins first started nesting on Seal Island. And that year there were 7 pairs of puffins nesting on the island. And we've had really great success on this island. We're still growing, but we now have over 500 pairs of puffins. So we went from having almost none in the early 90s to over 500 today. And we're still growing, and they're starting to nest on other places of the island where they have not nested before, which is really great news. Through these restoration activity is it wasn't very easy to get the puffins to nest here. And what they actually had to do to get the puffins to nest here, it wasn't as simple as just hand rearing them. They actually put out decoys across the rocks, and you guys see that one on the loafing ledge cam. This year we have a common murre up there, but I've been changing it the past few years. A couple years ago we had a puffin, and we had a razorbill last year, and now we have a common murre up there. But those little decoys are used to simulate a puffin on the island, and they also used mirror boxes, so when a puffin would look into it, they thought there was another puffin there. This year we monitored a lot of different species. We monitored the common and Arctic tern, the Atlantic puffin. We did some monitoring of razorbills, as well as the black guillemot, razorbill, some cormorants, and I have some notes on some other species as well. So I'll first kick into our terns. Our terns did very well this year in terms of their productivity. Now when I say productivity, what I mean by that is the number of chicks that were hatched and fledged on average per pair. So this is an average number that I'm giving to you when I tell you these numbers. And I'll give you these for puffins as well. But what it means is for each pair of terns on average they fledged one chick or two chicks. But this will be an average number, so it'll be kind of in between. This year our common tern productivity was 1.15 chicks per pair, which is actually the third highest productivity that we've had for common terns since monitoring first began in the early 90s. Last year, just to give you an idea of how much better of a season this was compared to the poor season we had last year, they only fledged 0.5 chicks per pair. What that means is on average, each pair had one chick that they fledged that they flew away from the island with, and last year they only had half a chick. Half a chick per average per pair is not really sustaining for a colony, especially not moving into the future, where we have a lot of uncertainties about diet and things like that. So being able to see the drastic increase, more than doubling the productivity last year for common terns and going all the way up to over one chick per pair, was really great to see. And the Arctic terns were very similar. Their productivity was 1.1, and last year it was 0.79. So we had a very successful year for the terns. But what's interesting about this is that our colony is actually declining in the size of it, despite the successful productivity we had this year. Last year we had about 1,300 pairs of common terns and 950 pairs of Arctic terns. And this year, when we did our annual tern census, which was going around the island counting all the tern nests that we possibly could, we only had about 1,000 pairs of common terns, which was a drop by about 300 individuals, and we went down to 700 pairs of Arctic terns, which is a decline of about 200 pairs compared to last year. Now the good news is that we don't think all of these terns are missing. What we've been noticing is there's a colony down in Massachusetts on Cape Cod, which is right along the coast. They have over 11,000 pairs of common terns nesting there, and they've been growing steadily by about 1,000 pairs each year, which is really great news. It seems like there's a lot of food down there, and they've been having some success, and we think that some of our common terns might be going down there, but it's hard to say definitively as of right now. So it is a little bit concerning knowing that we had a big drop in our colony size, but perhaps we know where those birds are moving to, and we think that it's probably because of food availability, but we're not 100% sure yet, nor are we 100% sure that our terns are going there. So this is something that we'll monitor closely, and we're going to as we move into the future. Now, the tern diet was not as diverse as it has been in past years, which is actually good news. Arctic terns also ate a lot of sand lance this year, whereas common terns didn't seem to be finding them as much. But herring is a great prey item, and the terns seem to be finding a lot of them, especially the common terns. I just found out that we had a network drop, so please ask any questions. I'm not really sure where I dropped off. But if something was confusing or I got cut off, please let me know where I did, and I can definitely go over something again. So we went through all the tern stuff very quickly. if you have any questions about that, I can certainly jump into it. Getting into the puffins, as I mentioned, had a great year, and there was a lot of food around. They were bringing in huge bill loads of sand lance and hake and herring, and especially herring is really exciting to see because out of all the fish that these birds are eating in the Gulf of Maine, the herring actually have the highest fat content out of all the species that they're eating, which is really good for chick growth and development. So this year, through our monitoring, we found out that we have over 500 pairs of puffins, which isn't too much of a change compared to last year. And what we're also seeing this year, as we did last year, is the puffins are starting to nest in areas of the island where they typically don't nest. Most of our puffins are actually nesting on one small area, relatively small area compared to the size of the island, on the northeast point of the island. If you look it up on Google Maps, I think there's a link to that on the Google Maps page on the Explorer website page for the loafing ledge. They all nest on that northeast point for the most part, but they're starting to spread out to other areas on the island, which is really exciting to see because there's a lot of potential for this colony to grow. Now it's very difficult for us to monitor those other areas because all of our bird blinds for the most part are on this northeast point. But we're doing our best to find those new burrows in other areas and continue to monitor how this population is growing. But it was great to see that we had over 500 pairs nesting this year. In addition to this year, because we had such good food supply, it means that a lot of the birds had more time to loaf on the island. You got to see them on the loafing ledge cam a lot more compared to last year. And this is primarily because when there's a lot of food around, the puffins don't have to spend as much time searching for food and can spend more time on the island. If there's young birds, they spend more time courting and looking for a mate and looking for new burrows. And even at the adults that have chicks, sometimes they can just rest on the island instead of just continuously searching for food for their chick. So this is a really good sign. It means that the adults were healthy and that there's plenty of food around. Now the puffins this year, they were primarily eating herring, hake, sand lance, and haddock. Early in the season, we had a lot of bill loads that were comprising of lots of smaller hake, which isn't the best prey item. We saw that a lot last year, and we didn't have a great year. But as the season progressed and those chicks got bigger, the parents started bringing in a lot more herring, and they were really big herring. Some of these herring were almost 2 or 3 times the length of the puffin's bill, which is excellent for these little chicks. It meant they were getting a lot of food. So that was great to see. We're continuing to see a lot of haddock. It's really only the past 5 years that we've been seeing a lot of haddock, which is great. Maybe a little longer than that. And that's a species that's been recovering from some overfishing. So that's also good to see. And we did have some sand lance in the diet. Like the hake, that seemed to occur earlier in the season. We had an obvious shift over to almost purely herring that occurred about the end of the first week of July. And that was great that happened because we had really, really good productivity for the puffins. And it's not uncommon for us to see well over 100 species of birds during this time. This year we saw about 175 species of birds just from May to September on an island where there's not a single tree. And lots of times we see very rare species that birders on the mainland get very jealous of and very excited about. So it's a really excellent time to see all these things happening, to see all this migration that is happening around us. We get to really see it in action, which is really exciting. And at night when we're sleeping in our tents, we can often hear these birds flying overhead because it's so quiet and there's no traffic noise or anything like that. Sometimes they give little call notes as they're flying south, so we get to see it in real time. So that was our season in a nutshell. It was a great year. We had a great field crew. All the birds did really well, which is really exciting to see. So I'm going to pull up some of your questions that you guys have pulling together here, and we will push through them. Let's see. Is there any explanation for the observed altercation between Willie and Billy on their last day in the burrow? The earlier part of the day was cozy, and they were very happy. So, jumping into this question, it's very hard to see. I never saw this video myself, but my guess is that sometimes, I've never seen it with puffins because we really only have, the only view that we get into the puffins' burrows is from these cameras. But what I have seen with terns, although they're not very related to the puffins, is when the terns are nesting and we're observing them, occasionally the mates will fight with each other. Sometimes if one of them can't find the chick or they don't bring enough food back, the other mate will sometimes get mad and actually attack them. I was just talking about the fledglings on the island. So I'm not sure. I think that I got through both of the puffins and the guillemots are completely on their own. We don't think that they reunite with other puffin chicks or adults or anything. They go to where the food are. So potentially if there's a lot of food in one area, there could be a lot of chicks there all feeding together, but they don't purposely seek each other out. But the one exception to this is the razorbill, and the father will often call their chick to sea. They fledge much earlier than the puffins or guillemots. They only need about 3 weeks in the burrow. And the father continues to feed that chick from sea, wherever the food may be. So they are a bit different. The next question is, do you band guillemot adults, chicks, razorbills, or terns? All right, I may need to skip back a little bit, depending on where I got cut off, but I will jump into the next question regarding whether which species we've banned on the island. So just to clarify what I mean when I say banding a bird, what we do is we put little metal rings around their legs. They're usually very, very light. The birds can easily fly around with them and hunt with them. But they all have a specialized number that will only identify that individual bird. And so we put those on the birds, and we also put another metal band that has a 4-digit alphanumeric code that with bigger letters that we can easily read with a spotting scope and identify that bird from a bird blind. Now at Seal Island, we do this for the black guillemot. We ban those chicks and some adults. We also ban the common terns and Arctic terns. We usually ban around 200 to 300 chicks of both the common and Arctic terns. And we also ban puffins. This year we banded about over 100 puffins. Sorry about all the technical difficulties today. We've been in some dense fog. I'm not sure if that's causing the network to go off and on a little bit. The next question is, of the 500 plus breeding pairs on Seal Island, how many produced eggs and how many hatched and fledged? So the way that we do things on Seal Island is you can't possibly see into all of the puffin burrows that are on the island. So we have ways of figuring out and estimating the number of breeding pairs on the island. And we do this from every year we monitor specific sections of the colony so we can see how they're growing or declining over time. And then we average those out, and we're able to figure out how many pairs are nesting on the island through observation, feedings, and looking at chicks and things like that. And what we do a similar thing for our productivity numbers, like I was discussing earlier. Now, we know that there's probably around 500 pairs. That's not an exact number. There's probably some more than that, or maybe a little bit less. But we can't tell you exactly how many of those produced eggs and exactly how many chicks fledged. But this is where that productivity number comes in. What we do every year is we monitor about 70 or so burrows where we can see the chicks clearly, and we're able to watch that chick be raised over time. We check on them every 4 or 5 days. And then we average out a number of how many of those 70 burrows fledged to chicks, and if they had an egg and the egg hatched, and then if they fledged that chick. Now, from that observation of all those 70 burrows, we're able to calculate a number of how many of them produced the eggs, how many of those eggs hatched. We get an average number for that, and then we get an average number of chicks that were fledged per pair. And I'm not sure if it was cut off, but this year we had 0.9 chicks per pair. That means that each pair almost for our productivity number, almost one pair, or each pair fledged one chick almost. Just a little bit less than that, which is a really fantastic number for a puffin to get that high of a productivity. So that's how we're calculating it. We can't figure out exactly how many chicks fledged from the island and things like that, just because it's impossible to see into all the different burrows and whatnot. The next question is, when you banded Billy, you took some feathers. Is that for DNA? Will you have the results? Could you please share with us whether Billy is a male or a female? So those feathers are actually for a different, there's a graduate student up at the University of New Brunswick who's actually studying the genetics of all the different nesting puffin colonies along the coast of Maine and into Canada. So she's been collecting samples, so Billy's feathers will actually be a part of that. Although we might take some feathers if Dr. Kress would like to see if we can identify Billy as a male or a female. Although we did take some bill measurements, which will be sent to Dr. Kress so we can compare them to Willie's, and we can see if we can figure out which one is probably the male and which one is probably the female. And whenever that information is available and Dr. Kress figures that out, I'd be happy to share that with everybody. The next question is also about the feather samples, and people were asking about the eye injury that Billy had early on in the season. And ultimately, the feather sample won't be able to tell us anything about her injury. However, it's not too unusual for these birds to get some type of injury. They're really fighting everything in nature to be able to raise this chick. It's not uncommon for us to find adult birds with wing injuries in altercations with other species, for example, or fighting with a neighboring adult. It's not uncommon for them to get an eye injury, maybe when hunting or something like that. So this does happen frequently, and often birds are very resilient. It takes a lot to stop a bird from raising a chick. And I've heard stories of shorebirds up in the Arctic that will lose a wing and they've still been able to rear those chicks. So there is one of the things that is happening on Seal Island is, as we see a rise in the sea surface around the world, we're also seeing stronger storms in the winter from climate change. And what this is actually causing is more erosion on the island. This does cause burrows to move around, but I don't think there's too much rock shifting. One thing that did happen is that Billy and Willie nested in a different area of the burrow than when we had Phoebe and Finn nesting in the burrow. They nested in a slightly different area, so when I put the camera in there, I had to change the angle a little bit, which probably made the entire burrow look a little bit different. I'm going to jump back into some of these questions again. I was talking about the burrows being eroded. Ultimately, I don't think that sea level rise in the immediate future is going to be a huge problem to these puffins, unless there's severe storms during the nesting period where big waves crash over the rocks and wash out eggs or chicks. But ultimately, most of these rocks are very heavy, big granite boulders where the puffins are nesting, at least where Conrad and Willie and Billy were. Their burrow is pretty secure, and I don't think that it's too big of a problem with erosion. There are some other areas where puffins are nesting on the island that are much more vulnerable to sea level rise and erosion. But it hasn't become too big of a problem yet, but it could be in the future with the current climate change predictions. Alright, I think that I'm live again. I'm going to back up a little bit just because I think it's hard for me to figure out when I've been dropped and when I'm live. As I was saying, it's a very foggy day out here, and perhaps that's messing with our connectivity with the mainland. Again, we're 20 miles off sea, and it's very difficult to keep anything going out here in terms of technology. The question that I was addressing when I was cut off was regarding erosion of the burrows where the puffins are nesting and sea level rise. And I was saying that ultimately Conrad and Billy and Willie's burrow was not really impacted by any shifting boulders or anything like that, but they did nest in a different area this year compared to past years in the Burrow, so I had to change the camera view. Now, there are some areas on the island where puffins are nesting closer to the water, that if a big storm did come in, it could impact those nesting puffins, especially during the nesting season. And erosion could be a problem in the future, especially given the current climate change predictions. All right, so I'm going to jump into the next question here. I'm sorry if I might have answered a question when I was dropped from the live cam stream, and I apologize if it got lost during that. What is really cool about puffins, and you've probably heard it sometimes, is the parents will call to their chicks, and often the chicks will call back. This is really important for the puffins to find their chicks. Sometimes the chicks can get very curious and they wander off, but ultimately it's those calls, those interaction calls, that will often tell a parent where their chick is. Often a parent will call when they come into the burrow if the chick isn't very obvious when they're bringing food. But if a chick was somehow got too far away from where their parent was bringing back fish and where their burrow was, then it is possible that they could think that their chick died or fledged, and they would start bringing back food. But we don't know exactly, beyond their vocal communications, we don't know too much about how they know if their chick is fledged or not. The next question is, do any of you working on the island watch at night during fledging time to observe the chicks as they make their way to the ocean? Just wondering if you're able to monitor their behavior during this mighty adventure. So unfortunately, we're not able to watch the puffins fledge on this island. On some other islands, they are able to do that. Up on Machias Seal Island, which I've mentioned a couple times today, they have around 5,000 pairs of nesting puffins. And some of their puffins have to cross a big grassy lawn that is actually near a lighthouse that's at the island, and they actually band a lot of chicks as they're making a way across the grassy field. We're not able to do that here, primarily because if we were able to go out into the colony at night, it would disturb a lot of the nesting terns and the puffins, and alter their behavior because all the birds are nesting so closely together. All of our tents are set back away from the colony specifically for this reason. However, there are some black guillemots that are nesting near our tents, and you can often hear them walking by in the late at night when they're fledging, or if you get up to go to the outhouse at night, you might stumble across one making its way to the ocean. And sometimes there's a big gully that's right next to the cabin where birds will sometimes get stuck in the vegetation, so we'll go down and help them to the ocean if they do get stuck. But we unfortunately don't get to see the puffins. I was really delighted to see of some video of some puffins fledging. It was really, really cool to watch the video that we captured with the infrared camera that we have set up there right now. So that's really fun to watch, and I love seeing the videos that you guys capture because it's something that I don't always get to see. Alrighty, our next question is, what are the chances that Conrad will come back to the same area, and when would he return if he does? So if Conrad does come back, it's hard to say exactly where he's going to set up camp and nest himself. He could go to a different island. It's entirely possible, but it's very difficult to say where he's going to go or where he's going to nest. That's difficult to predict. There is a strong possibility that he will come back to Seal Island. That is probably the most likely thing that will happen. But it's hard to say where he'll nest. It seems unlikely that he would try to nest right next to the burrow that he was raised in. I think it comes down to availability and wherever his mate wants to nest as well. But if he does return, he really could come back as early as next year, especially if it's a good food year. Like I was talking about earlier, we saw tons of young puffins this year. I didn't get the band numbers, but I did see multiple 2-year-old puffins that were born last year that were around the island, and they had bands, but I only saw them when I was in our boat on the water. So I could just see the bands as they flew by, but I wasn't able to read them, unfortunately. I did see many birds that were 3 years old this year on the island, so it is possible. that he can come back. I saw lots of birds that I banded back in 2015 as chicks this year. So I would say that it's most likely for us to first observe him in 2019. And once they turn 4 years old, there's a very good chance that you'll probably see them. We saw lots of birds that were banded as chicks this year back in 2014. Saddened to see this one did not survive after it seemed to be doing so well. In your time on Seal Island, have you ever seen 2 ghillie chicks successfully fledge? Yes, I've seen it quite a bit, actually. It's not too unusual to see guillemots fledge 2 chicks. We saw it quite a bit this year. Not as much last year, and we did see it a lot in 2015. And when I was working on Eastern Egg Rock in 2014, we did see it quite a bit as well. So it really depends on food supply and how good the parents are. There's a few burrows on this island that I've monitored the past 3 years, and it seems like every year they've raised 2 chicks. So I think that, especially raising 2 chicks, I think the more experienced parents seem to have more luck raising 2 chicks. And it's unfortunate that the Burrow cam parents haven't raised 2 chicks, but it's not impossible that next year they won't. We do see it quite a bit, as I said, and hopefully that will happen in the future. But unfortunately, it's pretty common to have that second chick die, especially if there's not quite enough food for both chicks to survive. Now I'm going to skip back a little bit here, and I think I might go over some questions that I think I got cut off from. Let's see here. Well, I think I originally got caught off, actually, when I was talking about the Puffin Diet this year. So, just to give you an idea about the progression of this diet over the course of the season, when we first started having chicks fledge towards the end of June, what we were seeing a lot of was small hake and some sand lance. The small hake aren't the best prey items for these puffins. They were very common last year. They're just not full enough of fat for these puffin chicks to build up the energy and that they need to fledge. Luckily that kind of tapered off, and towards the end of the first week in July, we started seeing an increase of herring. Now these herring are very fatty. I apologize if I'm repeating this, but I wanted everybody to hear this. The herring are the most fatty species that the puffins or any of these seabirds are eating in the Gulf of Maine. They have the highest fat content, which is really important for chick growth and development, which was great to see. And we had this from July all the way up to the few burrows that are remaining on the island. I've seen their parents bringing in billloads of herring still. And the other species that we're seeing quite a bit of this year was haddock. And haddock is kind of a cool species as they are a bit overfished in the Gulf of Maine. And it's only really the past 5 years that we've seen a lot of haddock in the diet for the puffins and a little bit in the terns. So it's really exciting to see that species. It's not quite as good as the herring in terms of fat content, but it is a good fish for these puffin chicks to be eating. So I wanted to just cover that diet thing one more time, just so you guys understood what the puffins were eating this year. The next question that I'll jump into was, what's your favorite fun fact about puffins? So there's a couple, I think that I'll talk a little bit about puffins here, but also a little bit about terns. I love both the puffins and the terns. They're both really fascinating birds. I think my favorite fun fact about the puffins is that we really don't know too much about what the puffins are doing in the winter. We're just starting to learn about where the puffins go on their migration, and there's still so much mystery surrounding what these puffins are doing when they're younger. We really don't know much about what the 2-year-old and 3-year-old birds are doing when they're not coming back to the island. So learning more about that would be really fascinating, and I think that's my favorite fact about the puffins, is that there's still so much mystery behind them. And then we still have a lot to learn about these puffins that are nesting in the Gulf of Maine. Now, my favorite fact about terns are specifically about the Arctic tern. The Arctic tern is it's really the migration champion of the entire natural world. These birds are phenomenal. They're really champion flyers. These guys nest in the Gulf of Maine here, and they fly all the way down to the ice packs of Antarctica. And some of our birds were even sneaking into the Indian Ocean, and then coming back up here each spring. So what we do know about these birds is that they're flying thousands of miles each year. And what I was able to calculate was that a bird we caught 2 years ago, who was 29 years old, we caught it in 2015, had flown from the Earth all the way to the moon, back to the Earth again, and then halfway back to the moon again. It's in lifetime, and that was just pure migration if you tracked it on Google Earth with following some of the migration tracks that we had. And that doesn't include any foraging on the wintering grounds or foraging to feed their chicks during the summer. So they're really champion flyers, and that's my favorite fact about the terns, and the Arctic tern specifically. The common tern doesn't migrate quite as far, but our birds spend the winter down in Brazil and Argentina. All right. The next question that we have here is there an off-island database where band numbers could be researched by Project Puffin to feed back who these puffins are? So on the island, all the islands that we're working on in Maine, we all have our own, there's a specific island computer where we have a database. It's a private database just for the islands of the National Audubon Society and the Fish and Wildlife Service. We're able to look up any band that we put on a puffin, a tern, or a razorbill, and we're able to look that up. We can see when the puffin was banded, when all the sightings were. So we're able to look that up. So when you guys take pictures of all the puffins and their bands, we're able to look that up and put that into our database. We're still trying to figure out the best way to take your sightings that you guys get on the cams and work them into our database. A lot of what we do on our database is to try to control for the amount of effort that we're putting in to our sightings, because we need to know how much effort we're putting in to watching the birds to get an idea of how many we're actually finding with the amount of effort we're putting in to compare to past years. But we're still trying to figure that out, and ultimately it's really cool to see you guys getting pictures of all the different bands and to identify these birds, because some of the birds you might take pictures of that we didn't see in the bird blinds when we were reciting the puffin bands. But not only are we looking for the puffin bands, but it's great to see you guys getting pictures too. All right. And I think that might be all the questions for the day. I apologize for all of the dropping of the camera here. It was very frustrating. But I'll be around for another 2 weeks on the island, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. So please try to tag me on the comment board, and I'll get to the questions as I can. And if I got cut off during anything regarding discussing how the season went here or anything like that, please just shoot me a message, and I'd be happy to respond to you and the rest of the community on the chat board. So I'll sign off for now, but please keep in touch, and thanks for another great season. All right, bye guys.